Robert William Pickton is a Canadian serial killer and former pig farmer suspected of killing close to 50 women. His case is one of many tragedies, horrors, and victims failed by an inept police force. Born on October 24th, 1949, Robert Pickton was born into a family of pig farmers spanning 3 generations in Port Coquitlam, British Columbia. Though his older sister Linda was sent to live with relatives in Vancouver, Robert and his younger brother David were not so lucky. Robert's mother Louise was said to be very demanding, often prioritizing the pigs over her own children and forcing them to work long hours raising the family's livestock from an early age. As a result, the brothers were often sent to school in dirty clothes, stained with the smell of manure. As you can imagine, this did not make life easy for the 2 brothers, and they were often bullied and called Stinky Piggy. Like most blossoming serial killers, despite the abuse and neglect, Robert felt a strong attachment to his mother and had little to do with his abusive father. In 1963, the then 14-year-old Robert would drop out of school and begin working as a butcher's apprentice, but leave his job to continue working on the family's farm by 1970. In 1978, Robert's father would pass away, and just a year later, his mother would follow. Neither of his siblings wanted the farm, so David took the house and Robert stayed running the farm from a trailer in a remote area of the property. Later in 1994 and 1995, Robert's 2 siblings would sell parts of their land for just over $5 million. Despite this, Robert would continue living on the farm, and one of his workers by the name of Bill Hiscox would describe him as a quiet guy who occasionally displayed bizarre behavior, despite not showing any evidence of substance abuse. An example of this bizarre behavior would be seen in 1996 when the Pickton farm was registered as a non-profit charity under the name Piggy Palace Good Times Society. The Piggy Palace was said to organize, coordinate, manage, and operate special events, functions, dances, shows, and exhibitions on behalf of service organizations, sports organizations, and other worthy groups, which was really just a dressed-up way of saying they planned to throw raves and parties in the converted slaughterhouse located on the farm. It said these events attracted around 2,000 people, some of which being sex workers and apparent members of the Hells Angels Club. On March 23, 1997, an elderly couple driving on a rural road outside Vancouver would spot a bloodied woman attempting to flag them down with handcuffs still attached to her wrist. The couple stopped and helped the woman, who told them her name was Wendy Eistetter. While in hospital, Wendy would tell police that she had been working as a prostitute in an area called the Low Track when she was propositioned by a man who called himself Willie. The first thing she noticed about the man was his overwhelming stench, but after the offer of drugs and alcohol, she agreed to get into his truck. Willie would drive Wendy out to his pig farm, and after the 2 finished, she would ask to borrow Willie's phone to call her boyfriend. As Wendy started to dial the number, Willie approached her from behind and attempted to handcuff her wrists. Wendy fought with Willie hard enough that he was unable to get the second handcuffed on her other wrist and instead attacked her with a butcher's knife. Incredibly, Wendy was able to get the knife away from him and slash his throat with it. Due to the loss of blood from his wound, Willie would then pass out and Wendy would run to the nearest road where she flagged the couple down. What Wendy didn't know was the man who had attacked her was in the exact same hospital as her, being treated for his wounds. Willie would turn out to be Robert Pickton, who would be questioned by police, and an orderly would uncover a handcuff key in one of his pockets that unlocked the handcuff fixed to Wendy's wrist. With this evidence, police would charge Robert Willie Pickton with attempted murder, aggravated assault, and unlawful confinement. However, the understandably terrified Wendy refused to testify against Robert, and despite the evidence they had and the elderly couple's testimony, prosecutors decided to drop the charges, concluding the courts would not believe a drug-addicted prostitute's story. Besides that, it's rumoured Robert was well liked as his Piggy Palace parties had attracted members of the police force, government officials, and local business owners. After being released on a $2,000 bond, the charges would eventually be dismissed. Unfortunately for Robert, the parties at the Piggy Palace would soon end after a lawsuit was filed for violations for neglecting the agriculture for which it had been zoned and having altered a large farm building on the land for the purpose of holding dances, concerts, and other recreations. While working for Robert over the years, Bill was not ignorant to his employer's behaviours. In 1998, Bill would phone Crime Stoppers asking police to investigate Robert, who he described as a sicko who often picked up prostitutes. Again, in 1999, Bill would go to police with suspicions, telling them he had heard from a friend that Robert had some missing women's belongings in his trailer. He would also tell of a time Robert joked to his friends about his meat grinder, telling them that if they ever needed to get rid of a body, his grinder was the best way to do it. Bill would go as far as to suggest Robert was serving human meat at Piggy's Palace, though these claims were never found to be true. Bill's insistence would result in police questioning Robert, who denied the claims and consented to have his property searched, though the police never did. Even more suspicion would fall upon Robert when a man tipped off police to a story he'd been told by Lynn Ellingson. She claimed while she was living with Robert, he had brought a woman home with painted toenails from the low track. Eventually, Robert and this woman went to his room to have sex, and Lynn stayed in the living room doing drugs until she passed out. Lynn later awoke during the night and heard a noise outside. She got up to investigate and saw a light on in the slaughterhouse. When she opened the door, she saw the painted toenails dangling inches from her face. The woman who she had seen only a few hours prior had been strung up and disemboweled. Lynn screamed, alerting Robert, who was in the process of slicing the flesh of the woman's thigh. Lynn quickly promised Robert she wouldn't tell anyone if he gave her drugs and cash, and he surprisingly agreed. Although this story was disturbing, Lynn herself had not made these claims to the police, and her alleged ties to the Hells Angels prevented her from speaking with them. For a second time, it appeared Robert would get away with murder while the women in the low track continued to go missing. During this time, Inspector Kim Rossmo conducted geographic profiling and found what he believed to be a serial killer operating within the low track. When this information was presented to the police, his theory was dismissed and Kim Rossmo was demoted. All the while, the police continued to publicly deny there was a serial killer. Eventually, the police force would succumb to public pressure and open a tip line in 2001. Unsurprisingly, several of these tips would once again mention Robert Pickton and his pig farm, but police still refused to take action. A year later, a truck driver who made deliveries to Robert's pig farm would call in with an unrelated tip, and on February 6, 2002, Robert's trailer was searched for illegal weapons. Searching through the filth, police would first find an asthma inhaler belonging to a 29-year-old missing woman by the name of Serena Abotsway. This would result in a second search warrant that would uncover clothing, shoes, jewelry, and an ID card belonging to several other missing women. Investigators would then search the over 40-acre property, employing heavy equipment, archaeologists, and forensic experts with a cost close to $70 million. In two of Robert's outbuildings, buckets containing skulls that had been cut in half with a bandsaw, and the hands and feet of Serena Abotsway, Andrea Josberry, and Mona Wilson would be found. Human remains would not only be found in plastic barrels, but also cut into pieces and stored in Robert's freezer. This would cause the Canadian health authorities to issue a public warning about any meat that had come from Robert's farm, as tests showed it had been contaminated with human flesh. Hundreds of tiny bone fragments would be scattered across the property, leading police to believe that Robert had in fact fed his victims to the pigs. On February 22, 2002, Robert Pickton would be arrested and charged with the first-degree murder of Serena Abotsway and Mona Wilson. But the search of Robert's farm would continue for a further 22 months, where investigators would take 600,000 exhibits and 200,000 DNA samples, uncovering DNA from an additional 33 missing women. While in jail, on 27 murder charges, Robert would make this gruesome confession to an undercover police officer.
I was into my work, maybe 50. That's what I was stopping people for. Yeah. I was doing more, maybe a big bad boy. Big flash.
On January 22, 2007, Robert would stand trial, but the judge would order due to the size and complexity of the case, the trial needed to be split in two. Robert found himself now on trial for the murder of 6 women: Marnie Frey, Georgina Papin, Brenda Wolfe, and Josberry, Abotsway, and Wilson. The trial would eventually conclude on December 7, 2007, where Robert Pickton was found guilty on all charges, but the jury did not believe Robert was smart enough to premeditate the murders, which resulted in him only being charged with second-degree murder. Regardless of whether the charges were first degree or second, Robert was awarded the harshest sentence known to Canadian law and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole for 25 years. Despite there being an additional 20 women whom police believe Robert to be responsible for murdering, prosecutors stated in August 2010 that they would not pursue these cases because even if he were to be convicted, it would not add any further time to his life sentence. Their decision justifiably outraged many of the families of the women who had been murdered by Robert. The case left the public asking how the police let a serial killer murder so many women over a 10-year span and did nothing. These questions would result in an inquiry into how the Vancouver police handled the Robert Pickton case, and this report would find blatant failures by police, inept criminal investigative work, and societal prejudice against sex trade workers and Indigenous women. One former investigator would claim the Royal Canadian Mounted Police had enough information to obtain a search warrant as early as 1997 but failed to do so. The inquiry would recommend the RCMP enact several reforms, including increased cooperation among the various regional police forces, increased funding for emergency shelters for sex workers, investigating missing persons reports immediately and keeping those files open until they're resolved. However, only some of these reforms were reluctantly adopted, and the Vancouver public received an apology from Police Chief Jim Chu for not catching Robert Pickton sooner. Much of Robert Pickton's property has since been redeveloped into urban housing and businesses such as Costco, Tim Hortons, and McDonald's. The only remnants of the land's past horrors is the lot where the DNA of 33 women was found. Now enclosed by a chain link fence, it's mostly empty, except for 2 dirt mounds and a barn with the sign Poco Valley Cattle Co. The victims' families pushed for a memorial site for those Robert had murdered, but instead, the city of Coquitlam created a nature park named Blackburn Lagoons, replacing the hopes of the memorial with a space to reflect, heal, and honor any person or circumstance of their choice. It would seem as time goes on, the only reminder to those outside of the families devastated by the pig farm murders is Robert Pickton himself, who at the time of this video is 72 years old and serving his life sentence at Port Cartier Institution in Quebec.